Welcome, and what a great turnout we have today. I must say there is nothing like a packed to the rafters lecture theatre to warm the heart of every academic in the room, and also our Vice-Chancellor, of course. My name is Janine O'Flynn. I'm Professor of Public Management here at the University of Melbourne, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the University today for what we know will be a thought-provoking event. As we get underway, please join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which our meeting takes place, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders past and present. Among very many distinguished guests today, please allow me to acknowledge a couple in particular. I have never been accused of having a soft voice, but let me make it even louder. It is not working. It is working from my end. Can someone please give me more noise? Something never requested before. Amongst the many distinguished guests joining us today, please allow me to acknowledge a few in particular. The former Governor of Victoria, Alex Chernov, former Premier of Victoria, Steve Bracks, our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Glyn Davis, and our Provost, Professor Margaret Shield, and of course our guest of honour, the former Prime Minister, Paul Keating. On behalf of the University of Melbourne and the Melbourne School of Government, it's a pleasure to welcome you all here to our campus for this In Conversation event to mark the publication of the book Paul Keating, The Big Picture Leader. In the way of introduction, before I welcome them to the stage, let me please introduce Troy Bramston. Troy has worked as a policy and political advisor and speechwriter in government, opposition, and in the private sector. In addition to his newest book, he is the author of several others, including Looking for the Light on the Hill, Rudd, Gillard and Beyond, and The Dismissal with his colleague Paul Kelly. Though for many of you he needs no introduction at all, let me please spend a moment to do just that. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating was first elected to the Federal Parliament in 1969 at the age of just 25. After serving as a minister in the Whitlam Government in 1975, albeit briefly, he was appointed Treasurer with the election of the Labor Government in 1983. During his time as Treasurer, he oversaw some of the most significant economic policy changes in Australia's history. Mr Keating was sworn in as Prime Minister in December 1991, coincidentally the year I finished high school, before I came here to the university. And he led the Labor Party onto its fifth consecutive victory in 1993. As Prime Minister, his big picture canvas was truly unfurled. I recall how captivated my generation were with him and his vision for Australia, his commitment to land rights, the Republic, our place in Asia, and the transformation of the economy. But we were also enamoured with his quick wit, his razor-sharp repertoire of insults, and his impeccable style. I also recall how many of us, looking at this big picture he was sketching out, grappled with how to balance the excitement of what this might be with the trepidation of what it would mean for our generation. Massive economic and social change, a more globalised world, and the recession we had to have. There is no doubt that Prime Minister Keating played a pivotal role in rewriting the narrative and reality of this country. In his concession speech in March 1996, he used a term often associated with his leadership when he said, "In the end, it's the big picture which changes nations, and whatever our opponents may say, Australia changed inexorably for good, for the better." To hear more about this big picture and his reflections on it, it is my absolute pleasure and my great honour to welcome the 24th Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating, in conversation with Troy Bramston. Thank you.
Well, can I thank you all for coming? I just want to do a mic check. You can all hear me okay? I want to thank you all for coming. It's a tremendous privilege for me to be here with all of you at this magnificent university, and also a real honour to be here with former Prime Minister Paul Keating. I want to acknowledge the Vice-Chancellor Glyn Davis for making this event possible. And I just want to make a brief comment about this book. I've lived with this book for many years. It's been a huge undertaking. researched in many, many archives around Australia and overseas, undertaken more than 100 interviews with people and around 15 hours of interviews with Paul himself. This book really does tell the story of a remarkable life, a remarkable Australian life, and a legacy that I argue changed Australia forever. It's extraordinary to recall that Paul Keating left school at 14, he was in Parliament at age 25, he was a minister at 31, treasurer at 39, and Prime Minister at 47. It is an extraordinary story, and I hope to give you an insight into this life and also to hear from Paul about some topical issues as well. So my first question, Paul, was going to be to ask you about the big picture, because this book is subtitled The Big Picture Leader. It really became a shorthand term to describe your policy and political agenda. It was first used when you were Treasurer. So how does the big picture describe how you conceptualised and approached politics?
Well, I think it's all about finding coordinates. Where is longitude and where is latitude, and otherwise, if you're not running on a big schematic, all of the changes happen rather unrelatedly and haphazardly, right? Rather than being part of a construct. Now, yeah, my task in public life was to overturn the whole Deakin legacy, that is, the whole closed nature of Australia, the fact that the place was shut in, ring-fenced by tariffs, quotas, which meant that, everything was on the cabinet table. The exchange rate, interest rates, wages, and through tariffs, prices. So it was a government-controlled economy, and a lot of people may say, well, what's wrong with a government-controlled economy? Well, the answer is mostly the government is not able to control the economy and not able to get it right. So we had to peel all the layers away, essentially peel away the Deakin construct from the turn of the century, which hadn't happened. So it requires a picture. It requires quite a big picture. And that's where the phrase really came from.
Now, I've often thought that politics in the end is about leadership. You define leadership as the combination of courage and imagination, but politicians also deal in power. So how did you learn about political power? How did you gain it? And then how did you seek to use it?
Well, I think the big thing in leadership is imagination. If you can't imagine a bigger, grander scheme, you're never going to get there. Whatever else, and the sort of the big dream. I do believe in, I've taken a lot of spiritual essence from the arts and culture, music, architecture, decoration, literature, histories, and the brain is like an electric motor. It requires some once you get the voltage running, it starts to turn over, and if you can keep it turning fast, it gets faster. So the big dreams, so-called, are a necessary part of the power one has to have to keep moving along. But where do the dreams come from? Where do the fantasies come from? They come from somewhere. So there's got to be a part of your mind that actually is open to whether, I've often said, I reconstructed the Australian economy with my three best friends, Mr. Marler, Mr. Brookner and Mr. Shostakovich, and that is basically true, you see. And you can give me a tune from any of those symphonies, I can pick it up.
So that's where the imagination comes from. But where does the courage come from? Where does the political power and the political authority come from? How do you squeeze that out of the political system?
I think it has to come from conscientiousness and a sense of urgency to get it done. In other words, not that it's a sort of a laissez-faire approach, it might happen here or it might happen here, but you actually drive the changes. But to drive the changes in a parliamentary system, you've got to bring the colleagues along with you, because they all have their little piece of power. They have their seat in Parliament, they have their seat in the Senate. You know, they're not going to get pushed around by the executive. So you've got to basically interest them in the story. And as the story twists and turns and twists again, you've got to consult them and bring them along with you. So it takes a lot of time to do these things, a lot of time. But you can get them excited about it and being part of a big project, you know. So the thing is, and the thing is about using the power. I mean, the one thing I was never afraid of is the power. Hanging on to the 415 volt cables when the switch is on, you know. You know, if you get a choice of being in charge or not in charge, you always take in charge. You know.
Well, can I wind the clock back a little bit to unpack that question about political power a little bit more? Because one of the interesting things when I was researching this book is looking into your relationship with former New South Wales Premier Jack Lang. Yeah. Now, when you were a teenager, one day you knocked on the door of his office in Sydney. He was then in his 80s, yeah. And then you started a relationship with him that lasted for more than 10 years. So, why did you seek out Lang, and what did you learn from him?
He fought all of the powers at the point of the Depression, and his indignation about the lot of ordinary people never waned. You know, he was never just a careerist politician. He actually believed in it all, you know. And he had this enormous ability to speak with massive conviction, you know, and power, energy. And that's what took. I mean, in fact, Jack Lang and I shared very little in policy. Like, he believed in tariffs, I never did, right? He believed in managed exchange rates, I never did, right? He believed in a lot of those things. But what he had, you've got to remember, in 1920, I think he became Premier in 28, before uniform taxation, after the Second World War, the effective Prime Minister was the Premier of New South Wales, effectively, because of the size of the state and GDP and the power of the place. The Commonwealth had defence, they had the currency, etc. So now we look at the states in a different way altogether than the way it was then, you see. So, and of course, as you know, he fought the Commonwealth, the conservative Commonwealth, about conservative policies, where he was supporting the policies that subsequently were adopted by Roosevelt and John Curtin. Now, the expansionary fiscal policy, what we call today Keynesianism, right? So, you know, this was a remarkable guy. So, and of course, he used to give me, he was at Henry Parkes's rallies, you know. He was Henry Lawson's brother-in-law. He just had, you know, he could give you a thumbnail sketch of Hughes or Latham or Joe Lyons or Evatt or anyone, you know. And they're mostly kindly. Yeah. And mostly kindly. I mean, there's the idea that he was sort of some sort of cranky guy who was sitting there, thought he'd been robbed by history, is just not true. But it did give you a chance to, he used to talk about their little personal foibles, you know. I mean, he gave me a book of Henry Parkes's letters to somebody he borrowed money from every week in Sydney, you know, and say, "Dear Mr. Campbell, could I get that £10, 5 shillings back to you by Wednesday afternoon? Henry Parkes," you know, and there'd be a reply, you know. So Henry obviously lived on debt. Yeah. Anyway, you know, so...
That is a key influence, I guess, in your political formative experiences, but your mother and your father, Matt and Min Keating, were obviously very interested in politics and interested in the Labor Party. So what was life like living at 3 Marshall Street, Bankstown, in the 1940s and 50s? How did that family influence shape your political outlook?
Well, if you look through economic history, there's no increase in real wages much for any working person for the couple of thousand years up to about 1945. The big growth in income started from the Second World War, really from the policies of Roosevelt and the kick-along from the Second World War, the so-called New Deal. So you know, I was born in 1944, just as the war is ending, And so in the western suburbs of Sydney, which would be like the western suburbs of Melbourne today, you started to see this international shift in incomes, which affected Australia, positively. Productivity rose, commodity prices rose after the war, and so all of a sudden people started to own a motor vehicle, which they wouldn't have owned before. They dressed better, well enough. Food on the table. So I grew up in that sort of society. When the local church was built, it was built by the people who were the parishioners. And the brickies did the bricklaying and the carpenters did the frame. That's a communitarianism which existed in those suburbs then. And so I was part of that.
And what about the direct political influences from your father and your mother? Because I remember interviewing your sister Anne, and she said you always discuss politics at the dinner table, and when the conversation might have drifted into something else, like what she was doing in her life, the conversation seemed to lull. And then when that was over, you and your father would get back to the politics.
Yeah. Well, my father was a very reasonable person. My mother used to say too reasonable. My mother was a complete killer. And she was like a lot of women born in in her case, at the end of the teens, in the 1920s. They just didn't have the opportunities that women have today. Yet they still had the power and the intellect. And so they saw this through their families and through their children. And my mother was one of them. Whereas my father was less driven, but he had this great idea about labour and capital, very fair ideas about labour and capital. And he believed that the Liberal Party could never do capital, right? And of course they can't do capital, I mean, they don't know what capital is or how it moves. And the Labor Party certainly didn't, The Labor Party always wanted to control capital, but they couldn't see a mix between capital and labour. My father did see that, We ran a business, it employed at its peak, I can't remember, 60 or 70 people, made ready-mix concrete machines, the first company in Australia to make ready-mix concrete machines. And so he was a manufacturer and an employer, as well as having been an employee in the railways, and secretary of the Boilermakers Society at Redfern, So he had sort of both sides of the street and couldn't understand why someone as talentless as Menzies had lasted so long. Here's this sort of vacuous dandy sort of moving along through Australian society while the Labor Party fought on the margins, and the DLP destroyed them in Victoria. And so therefore he always thought of there was some better model. And I picked it up from him.
So you run for Labor pre-selection for a safe Labor seat, the seat of Blaxland. You're only 24 years old. You see off half a dozen other challenges, and you knock off a long-term sitting Labor MP. Now, what drove you to think that at that young age you should be in Parliament?
Oh, you must be invested with the confidence. You must have the confidence. I got that from my grandmother. My grandmother thought I was the absolute centre of the world. I could do nothing wrong. I mean, my sister was always chastised if she even in any way got me into any sort of trouble, She was completely one-eyed. But that big investment, I do think that big investment in love in you carries you along. And I had that, from her and my mother and father and family. And it's like the tin suit, that you can move on knocking the brick, don't worrying about the brickbats, not about incoming missiles. They mean less, So, but you've got to have, I think you should have the inner confidence. That's not to say that you reach a certain level in public life where you truly have to say to yourself, is it better that I drop back and let someone else get ahead of them because they have more to offer than me? And I used to assess my colleagues in this way. I mean, you've got to be, in a parliamentary party, you've got to be very fair to people. You've got to say, if this guy's got more to offer, I'll let him through, But what happens in elections is a lot of people who have a lot to offer get knocked out. People in marginal seats get knocked out. And if you're in a safe seat, which I was, you tend to wear a lot of other people off, you know. Mm. So, and then as you start to pick up the construct about the economy, society, you start to develop your own model about how it should be. And once you get that confidence, I used to say to people in the cabinet, their confidence is not like a sort of tin of Popeye spinach, you know, you take the top off it and swallow it down, all of a sudden you're confident, you know. Confidence you have to earn, but if you have it, you have the great power, you know.
Now, you were 25 when you were sworn in as the member for Blaxland. Would you encourage a young person who's 25 years old today to go into politics?
Oh yeah, of course I would. Of course I would. But it's a hard road to hoe. I mean, the great pity of Australia was that we didn't have the national parliament in Melbourne or in Sydney, you know. We ended up with the rump capital in Canberra. And that means that people have got to fly out of their homes and, you know, go to the Boys and Girls Club and, you know, they go back to their motel room with the morning newspapers and, you know, it's pretty soul destroying. And because the facilitation of the place is such, you can't walk out into a capital city like you would here in Melbourne or in London, say, then you're bound up in the building, and the way the rules work, you've got to be there within 3 minutes of the division bells. And all. So it has this very bad karma about it, you know.
Well, let me ask you then, in terms of the sacrifices that you have to make in a political career, in terms of your family, in terms of your income, public and media scrutiny, is it still worth it today?
Well, it's the ultimate high wire act. It depends whether you want to be on the high wire. And
the other thing I was going to ask you was if you didn't go into politics, you mentioned your father's small...
the rest, look, people have great lives and do important things.
Yeah.
You know, but what public life has is a leverage. It's got the leverage. You move your little finger this much, the world moves that much. So this is the game to be in. If you're into improving societies on a macro basis, right? Not many people get that chance. But if you get the chance, you've got to be conscious of the leverage. But with the leverage comes a responsibility. You know?
And I guess the message there too is having a vision, wanting to do things, but having that inner confidence that you spoke about as well. I mean, you need those things to succeed in political life today?
Oh, I think you can't succeed without it. I mean, you can get along. Lots of people... Look, most people who go into our parliaments go in with the best of intentions, you know? But they don't go in with the best equipment. They go in with the best intentions, you know? And learn on the job and improve as they go. We all learn on the job, but we keep on learning. You know, we're all learning every day. I'm learning every day. You know? But you also have to have that sense of responsibility. That is, you don't change a country unless you visit the problem on yourself. You can't lay it off onto the people behind you, the cabinet, the bureaucracy, you know. Yes, they're there. The artillery is there to help. But in the end, there has to be a commanding general, you know. And so that is something that the visitation of that responsibility onto you is what drives you to get the changes through.
Have you ever thought about what you would have done if you didn't go into politics? I mean, your father ran a small business. Yeah. You, of course, managed the Ramrod's Rock and Blues Band.
That's the point I have to make about how here he was, a Bowser boy with his father's garage in Earlwood, you know, two of them pumping petrol. At least we were running a reasonable sized business, you know. I could have been, you know, a businessman, and in fact the concrete company we sold grew later in other people's hands and was sold in the 1990s for $400 or $500 million, you know. Now, was I clever enough to run the thing to get $400 or $500 million? I don't know. But the thing is, what would you do with the money anyway? You know, you can only live in one house and have one meal and one car, you know.
So, Paul, you go into Parliament in 1969, John Gordon's Prime Minister. He's soon replaced with Billy McMahon. Gough Whitlam's leading the Labor Party. You see through the Whitlam years, you learn some vital lessons there. But I wanted to ask you about the dismissal of the Whitlam government, because you were a minister just 3 weeks before then, and Gough Whitlam, I think, too meekly accepted his political death. But you told me you would never have accepted his dismissal at the hands of John Kerr. What would you have done differently?
Oh, I would have arrested Kerr. I would definitely arrested I would have had the Queen replace him. You know, this was Kerr was an accident waiting to happen. Gough's great problem was choosing him in the first place. You know, I mean, when I chose Bill Dean, you've got to look through the personality, what people stand for, what they're truly, where their lives' ambitions are, what their record is, and you do need X-ray vision to see this. But you didn't need much with Kerr. You know? And then Gough made this terrible mistake of calling him my Governor-General. And once he said of Kerr that Kerr was his creation, this offended everything in Kerr, you see. I don't know. Anyway, he had a voice like Cheap Scent, I know that. He was a very unattractive character, you know. And I was with Gough the last time Gough saw him before he was dismissed. The three of us were at Government House for a meeting the Executive Council. And there's not a doubt in the world that Kerr deceived him. And as we got back in the car to go back to Parliament House, I said to Gough, this is right in the middle of the crisis, I said, well, he seems all right, Gough. And he said, he's entirely proper, he'll do the right thing. That's what he said.
Well, we all know how history played out.
He was entirely improper and he did the wrong thing.
Now, of course, Labor loses the 1975 and 75 elections. Bill Hayden becomes leader, and then eventually Bob Hawke replaces Bill Hayden and leads Labor to power in 1983. You, of course, became Treasurer. Now, one of the things I argue in the book is that this was the premier reform government that really turned Labor orthodoxy on its head, smashed the policy foundations of the Federation era, and remade Australia. Now, what is the contemporary relevance of that reforming government when you were Treasurer for politicians today who seem to struggle to design, articulate and implement policy? What's the lesson, the contemporary relevance of those huge reforms that were achieved during the Hawke-Keating government?
Well, I think the contemporary relevance is that practitioners today have got to be alert to the changes happening around them in the country and around the world. So, you know, somebody said the other day, one of my colleagues said, I was still talking about the 1980s. I mean, I'd be doing something completely different now. Completely different, you know. I mean, the world has never, I mean, the post-war world, the template of 1947, so-called, you know, the cooperative model the United States put into place, you know, the multilateral model, you know, it's breaking down. We're going back to a world of great power rivalries. You know, alliances are weakening, etc. And so, you know, when the game changes, you change. You know, when the game gets nasty, you get smarter, you know. So I'd say the contemporary relevance of the question you asked me is why Australia is doing well is we've had the flexibility in the exchange rate, in wages, you know, in our industrial structure. You know, we haven't had a recession in 25 years, and this has, in a sense, saved the place from the ignominy it would have had as an industrial museum, with all of its rigidities, you know. But that's now we've got to go on. In the new world starts with the digital age. The great change in our time is the fact that we're all connected one to each other across the world in these handheld devices, you know, these handheld computers. And so this is breaking down national barriers. You know, the world now becomes a factory. The factory's not anymore in the suburbs. The Fordist model is gone, you know. And so therefore you say, yippee, we've got a new set of problems, you know, new set of problems. How do we get sorted in these things? So that, and I think it's that trying to recognise the shifts and then start putting remedial changes into place. I think that's the lesson of the 1983 to 96 government.
Now I want to move to your Prime Ministership, but before that I need to ask you about Bob Hawke, because you did have a complex relationship with Bob, and I write about that in the book, but you really were an unbeatable duo as Prime Minister and Treasurer. Yeah. And eventually you wrested the Prime Ministership from him after 2 leadership challenges in 1991, but you were not triumphant about it. You told me that you were actually sad. Why were you sad about that?
Well, I wanted Bob to go on time in a way, you know. He'd agreed to go and said he'd go, but you know, he sort of got used to the job and all the things of it and staying there. And that was okay while I was chief cook, bottle washer, saying to you, what about this trick, Bob? Right? Oh, well, not that trick. Oh, all right, well, what about this trick? You know, what about that trick? In the end, I got, you know, after sort of 9 or 10 years, I got sick of doing tricks, you know. And getting poorly marked as well, you know. So in the end, I said to Bob, if you are not any more useful to me, Bob, there's no point in you staying. You know, if you are not prepared to run my agenda, there's no point in you staying.
Well, the 1991 leadership contest was an extraordinary political battle, but you didn't have...
I should say, but there's a great friendship between Bob and me.
There is,
I mean, the thing about this huge thing we were doing and the huge use of power, you have to have... I mean, Bob and I have had many good moments, thousands of them, friendly, good moments, you know, and joy in craft, you know, pleasure in the shifts, etc. But, you know, the jobs are so taxing. They're so taxing. I was doing 2 budgets a year for 8 years, you know, a May statement and a budget. I did effectively 16 budgets. And the May statements are all bigger than the budgets, you know. That in the end, you have to, yeah, it's a bit like, I remember the story of Churchill. He went late in the night to be sworn in as Prime Minister, and the fellow driving him picked him up and took him as they left the gates. He said, well, Mr. Churchill, I congratulate you on becoming Prime Minister, but it couldn't be on a worse day, because the Nazis had just invaded Belgium. The Dutch Queen had come across to London the same day. He said, yes, George, but at least now I'm in command of the field, right? And in the end, there is a point where you must take command of the field. You can't run the job through somebody else, you know?
Well, you didn't have really any time to think about the leadership challenges and the transition for long, because you had United States President George Bush arriving in Sydney within a week or so. And the first big thing that you did was to put to him the idea of the APEC leaders meeting. And I write about this extensively in the book, including writing about the meeting record that was taken on your side and also on his side about this discussion. And it's very interesting, but you had a very clear vision to him at this meeting, which took place at Kirribilli House, about Australian foreign policy being more independent in its outlook, Australia pursuing its own interests and not regarding the United States as a strategic guarantor. Have we reverted from that vision in recent years?
Oh, yes. I mean, look, the treaty with the United States, the ANZUS treaty, is a great asset for us and a great thing for us to have. But what it means is that we're obliged to consult each other in the circumstances of strategic difficulties, right? But the trouble with it is, for people without the intellectual dexterity or, in the end, intellectual honesty, they're now regarding the American alliance, there's no alliance mentioned in the treaty, as some sort of sacrament, having some sort of sacramental quality, you know? In other words, they have so little confidence in our own ability to construct a foreign policy and operate it, particularly with these big shifts in the world, with China now as large in GDP as the United States. You know, there's these massive shift of power from the west to the east, you know? You want a dexterous, mobile, clever foreign policy. Instead of that, we have these dullards, basically, you know, gluing us on to the American alliance as though it's a sort of sacrament, you know. And of course, if you speak against the sacrament, well then of course it's almost seditious, you know. Look, the Americans are always going to be important in the Pacific Ocean and the Western Pacific particularly, but they've got to be the sort of floating good guys, They can't be the framers and the guarantor, because China will never be a strategic client of the United States in the way in which Japan has been a strategic client of the United States for 70 years. For 70 years. The Chinese will never do this. So the US trying to frame them and remain the strategic hegemonist, if you like, just won't work. So therefore, if you have a treaty arrangement with the United States and a long friendship, then it behoves you to think about a policy which has got flexibility and movement.
Okay, well, can I ask you about that? Because we do have a new United States president. You actually met with 3 US presidents in office. You met Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office in 1983 with Bob Hawke, of course, George H.W. Bush, and you had many meetings with Bill Clinton. So how would you deal with Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, we've got to know what Donald Trump's policy is. We don't really know, but we have a clue. Here's what I said the other day. He's a great power guy. He sees the US, he sees the, let's call it, the general international responsibility the US has taken on since 1947 as being too large a burden on the United States, too unfair an impost, relieving obligations on countries like Japan, Germany, continental Europe, ourselves, for instance, and therefore saying, look, it's our turn, the US's turn to worry about itself, you know. And this is a pretty appealing message for Americans, you know, start worrying about themselves. And so therefore, and you see, globalisation's just decimated Western economies. I mean, we are in a better world when 600 million Chinese have been lifted out of poverty, about 150 million Indians, all sorts of other people. Globalisation has been a great force for equality around the world, but it has absolutely devastated the industrial scale, the industrial framework of the United States, of Western Europe, of Britain and other countries, right? So when Trump won the so-called blue wall states, you know, the Michigan, Wisconsin and those, it's really saying, he's like Peter Finch hanging out of the window. We're not taking it anymore. You know, so globalisation, you know, it's wrecked us, it's chopped our heart out, and we're not having any more. And they said, you're for us, right? So that's how he won. That's how he won. So the point about it is, that's not reversible. That's not reversible. But the notion that the US should be thinking about itself in its own terms is, I guess, a popular notion now in the US. But how silly would we be not to pick up the message? They're, in a sense, starting to refocus on themselves and not the alliances. But we've got this group in Australia saying, oh, please don't let our hand go. Oh, please hang on to us, you know. Please hold, oh, don't let us go, you know. I mean...
Well, I guess Donald Trump is a shock to the political system, the geopolitical system. So was Brexit in the United Kingdom. And there is a risk, I think, not only on the extremes of politics, but in the major parties, that their response to this is to go towards populism, protectionism, nativism. Do you worry about that being the policy response?
Well, it's never going to pay off for them, you know. I mean, you look at Australia, you look at it, I mean, when I became Treasurer, the effective rate of protection on a car was 93%, right? Today it's zero. It's effectively zero, right? So you can pick up a car for what, 17,000, 16,000. You want one a bit better, 23,000, you know, and if you can go, of course, if you've got more money, you can go further up the scale. But those cars today would be $40,000. So your income to give yourself a motor vehicle would be, your purchasing power would have been dramatically reduced. This was true for the shirts on your back, the singlets you wore, everything, you know. And what brings down prices is competition. So I wanted to take the tariffs away and introduce a big competition policy. And you can see that in mobile phones, you can see it in electricity, you can see it in the price of ordinary goods. So the idea that we can sort of move back to some sort of protected society is crazy, because particularly with the digital age coming, I mean, now we're going to move to a much more lateral, collaborative world with peer-to-peer commercial arrangements. You know, the old silos, the vertical silos of industrial capitalism are going to be chewed away by the digital age. And so therefore, to be a player in this age, you've got to have the brain power, you've got to have the education. In other words, what we want is higher levels of education, more specialisation, more dexterity. What we don't want is a return to protectionism and some idea of the past, you know.
I want to ask you just a few quick questions, if we can. I'll finish up and then we'll ask the audience to ask some questions. I wanted to ask you about the High Court's Mabo judgment in 1992, because that really presented you with your greatest challenge as Prime Minister, and that was the Native Title Act. It often looked like it was doomed to fail, and I was quite struck by this in researching that year of 1993, where it did look like it would never get over the line. Yeah. Why didn't you give up when the political benefit to the government was probably negative in pursuing that issue?
Well, it might sound trite to say, but there's such a thing as justice and inclusion, you know. The Abs were always dudded. They were always dudded. And all of a sudden, the High Court says that the Act of Sovereignty, the claim by the British on Australia, had not extinguished an underlying native title. So there wasn't, but the judgment said, there is a title, but we don't know what it is. We don't know who has it or how you can get it. And so my job was to construct an Act of Parliament to say what the title was, who could get it, and who could enjoy it, which meant building a great body of cultural and property law in one go. And I was racing against time. I mean, the West Australian Premier wanted to extinguish all native title in the interim, and actually tried. The High Court had to invalidate the West Australian Act. And the colleagues in the Labor Party in Queensland were only just a tad better, just a tad better. 2/3 of the caucus wanted to give up on the Native Title Act. So, remarkably, the court says a native title has survived the Act of Sovereignty. So, those grants of interest in land, those lands not alienated from the Crown, those not subject to a grant of interest, like, say, someone's suburban backyard is here or block is here, or the land upon which this university sits, is alienated from the Crown, and therefore the native title is extinguished. So what we're talking about is the unextinguished native title across lands mostly in the outback, mostly in the outback. So how mean a society would we need to be to say they can't even have that?
Now, one of the people that you work closely with in developing the Native Title Act was, of course, Noel Pearson, who launched this book on Monday. He had some pretty tough things to say about the ABC's reporting of Aboriginal issues. He said the ABC was a fundamentally racist organisation because it focused too much on reporting misery and tragedy. Do you agree with the essence of what he was saying then?
Well, Noel's always taken the view the ABC has been very hard on him. That is, see, he has a view against the polity within the ABC, which is about the sort of, essentially, I'll make it simple, the welfare approach to Aboriginal policy. He's taking a view that Aboriginal people are best when they are able to earn their own incomes and live their own independent lives, and that welfare diminishes their standing, their inner confidence and their position, right? So he was a natural target for those people who believed this was an erroneous view. And it may be true to say, and I'm not saying it, by the way, but it may be true to say that the ABC promulgated the view that a shift away from a welfare basis for Aboriginal support was a wrong way to go. He takes the view that he never got any support from the institution for his view.
But do you think the ABC does focus too much on misery and tragedy stories?
I think the ABC is now, the 7:30 report, the ABC News, 7:30 is full of hard luck stories, laden with hard luck stories. It's not that the stories don't have virtue or that the problems are not real, but in the gradation of news for the day, you know, they're trying to become, in the case of the 7:30 report, a news magazine, instead of a hard news breaking operating on a wide front. And in the case of the ABC News, I mean, if you want to watch a good news service in Australia, watch the SBS News, because they grade down all the international stories. I mean, you want to find out what's happening in Iraq, what's happening with the US elections, what's happening now with Trump. You look at SBS. You don't look at it, because what you'll get on the ABC is a truck's just overturned on the Pacific Highway and there's a big flame out, you know. The same as 9 and 7, you know what I mean? So the ABC is letting Australia down in terms of its news presentation, the quality of the news and the weight of the news.
Can I ask one quick question and ask for a quick response? You achieved a lot in your political career, an extraordinary amount, but one thing that remains unfinished business was, of course, an Australian Republic. You made that a key strand of your big picture agenda. Why is this so important for Australia still today?
Well, it tells us who we are and what we are. I mean, that we're a nation alone to ourselves, confident in ourselves, able to represent ourselves around the world as ourselves. Instead of that, here we are, 2 centuries on, we're borrowing the monarch of another country. I mean, it's pathetic. I mean, it's deeply, but the monarchy in Australia is a deeply pathetic idea, you know? You know, and God knows, you know, Prince Charles, Prince Philip and others have all given us a clue. They would be happier to be out of it, as far as we're concerned, right? Happy to be, you know. And the Queen accepted my view when I saw her, that if we were to become a republic, she would be much more welcome here as the Queen of Great Britain, with all of the sort of historical and cultural ties, than she would ever be welcome pretending to be Queen of Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I interviewed...
But it's more than that. We can't make our way in the world and be taken really seriously, particularly with these great states like China and India rising, and this massive archipelago to our north, Indonesia, and say, by the way, our head of state is the Queen of Great Britain. You know, that's where we are.
We might go to questions from the audience. We've just got a few minutes, and Heath and David are they've got some microphones which we'll pass to you. Now, there are 2 things to keep in mind when you ask a question to Paul Keating. It's got to be a question, not a statement, and it's got to be a brief and clear question. So we've got a hand up over here. We might start over there.
Can you just pass it along, please? Thanks. Thank you very much for your talk. That's a statement, I apologise for that. So you're talking about the situation with America and the ANZUS Treaty. If there was to be kind of a great power conflict between China and America, or China and Russia, or a confluence of similar powers, what would you think that would be, what do you think the best thing for Australia to do in that situation would be?
Well, I've taken the view, I said to Bill Clinton in 1997, the United States should consolidate the Atlantic. You know, it has 17 trillion of GDP in America, it's got Mexico and Canada to the north, it's got the protection of both oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. It's the underwriter of European peace and prosperity, you know. It has NATO. It, by the way, shouldn't have NATO, but it still has NATO. Its great challenge is to bring Russia into Europe. That was a great challenge for the United States at the end of the Cold War, to bring Russia into Europe. It's failed to do that. But it has the possibility of consolidating the Atlantic. In the Pacific, it can't consolidate the Pacific because of the rise of China. So in the Pacific, it should be the balancer and the conciliator in the Pacific, not the guarantor and the framer and the guarantor, as it can be and is in the Atlantic. That means that the United States has to find a point of accommodation with China, but it is in the interest of all of us to have the United States in the region. Don't mistake my view about that. I am for the United States remaining in the Pacific and the Western Pacific in particular. But that also means recognising that the rise of China is legitimate, and that the Chinese are not going to be some subservient, strategically subservient place. So the aim of the game is to avoid great power conflicts, but countries make mistakes. The United States made a huge mistake in not winding up NATO in 1991. You know, so that they bit off bits of the pie crust off the old Soviet Union. They put Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic into NATO, and then Estonia and Latvia into NATO. And now, of course, they've developed the counter-NATO. And you might have seen Mr. Putin this week is going to put tactical nuclear weapons along Russia's southern western border. So, in other words, what I feared would happen in the 90s is that the maintenance of an aggressive NATO would produce a counter-NATO, and the counter-NATO is now coming. Now, this just means there is a role now for statecraft, for the flexibility of diplomacy, you know, because what happened in the First World War is the flexibility of diplomacy was inoperative or unable to operate when we had the rigidities of the treaties between Russia, France and Britain against Germany. What we've got to do is avoid these, if you like, these immobile, framed, locked up strategic answers. In other words, we're after mobility and flexibility and diplomacy. I mean, the best weapon you can have is diplomacy. It costs you nothing. You can get out there and try and make some of this stuff work. So the answer is, we need the US in the Pacific. We need them, but we need them as the floating good guys. If they try and remain as they were after the Nixon-Mao deal in 1972, where Mao essentially gave strategic hegemony to the United States and recognised it, that's all over. That all fell apart the day the Soviet Union was dissolved. In 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved a week after I became Prime Minister. When that happened, China no longer needed the United States to deal with Russian divisions on its border. They all went away. But the Chinese were not strong enough to push the United States away or keep them from their borders, but they are now.
Okay, there's a question. We might go to the lady in the green shirt, just up there.
Thank you. Today, the politicians in charge of governing seem to lack the kind of vision that characterised your era in government. There's a real narrowing down that I think everybody is concerned about. It creates a kind of paralysis, and it seems as if each major party seems to be self-interested rather than concerned about national issues. And you hear this regularly in the discussions in Parliament. So I'm just wondering how you think we can redivert their attention to the real structural reforms that are required, particularly to take advantage of the digital era, because we don't seem to have the structures in place.
Well, look, it gets back again to this question of one's compulsion. One must feel compelled to take the problems on, big as they are, but feel compelled to try and arraign the forces to deal with the problems, you know. In my case, I had nearly a decade and a half to do it, but I spent a decade and a half doing it. You know, I didn't have a lay day, you know. I kept pushing all the time, squeezing the system every day, you know, to get the best outcome I could have. I used to say to the cabinet, we don't cut corners. We don't cut corners, you know. You're always after the best result. Look, I don't know. People today talk about reform, You see the Financial Review talks about it every day, so does the Business Council. And Australia never had reform. Australia never had reform. I mean, we had the Deakin policy from sort of 1900 to 1980, 80 years of it, you know, with various people strutting the stage, but no one altering it, no one changing it. And there's no guarantee, notwithstanding the fact there are many valuable people in public life today, there's no guarantee that they can coalesce the power and recognise the problems and then have the energy to deal with it. Right? You've got to bet the bank all the time. I mean, I used to say to Bob, what we do is spend the capital at every election. Let's not be safe. Let's keep changing the place all the way. And with a bit of luck, the mob will say there's some value here. We're going to stick with this crowd, you know. But at some point, they get bored with it and they catch up with you, you know. That's just the way life is. But you do at least want political parties to recognise the problems and the issues, and earnestly, and I put a big underline, earnestly go after them. Like, you know, I was just asked a question about the United States and China, but if you are earnest about it, it's full of complexities. It can't be resolved with a simple answer, you know. So what we need is that conscientiousness, that earnesty of purpose, and the compulsion to get the stuff done, you know. It's a big wear-out factor, but that's what you've got to do.
There's a gentleman here in the black shirt down the front here had a question. Just wait for the microphone.
Yeah, Mr. Keating, what do you see being the impact of neoliberalism and ongoing economic growth on climate change? And secondly, what do you think should be done about the heavy reliance on coal in Australia, both domestically being used, and Australia is the world's second leading exporter of coal, which of course contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change?
Yeah. Well, you know, we did have a climate change policy. Gillard, Prime Minister Gillard brought in her government, put a price on carbon, and a subsequent government removed it. I mean, the Abbott government was elected to office on these sort of three lies, you know, debt and deficits, and in the end there was little urgent debt to speak of, and the deficits weren't a problem at the time. And the second one was the mining tax and the carbon tax. Right, so we removed the carbon tax, which was having a quite substantial and dramatic effect on pricing for electricity, so that brown coal, for instance, was priced out, and all other manner of carbon-based fossil fuels, etc. There was a price on it. So, you know, President Obama at least brought a measure of power to this question with the Chinese, the two biggest emitters, and we got some international agreement from that, right? The risk for us now is, of course, President Trump moves away from that, and the risk for us is, of course, we've moved away from the pricing policy ourselves. I mean, climate change is just now one of the global problems we have to deal with, and Australia made a big mistake in shifting away from pricing carbon, and we'll have to, in some form or another, shift back to it.
Other questions? Lady in the red jacket just there, on this side.
Former Bureau Chief in Federal Parliament, apologies. The question goes back from what Troy was saying earlier. If you were not to have taken the path that you have,
If you're not,
what if you had not taken the path that you have, and you were an after-dinner speaker, would you be an adjudicator on a debate, or would you prefer to be in the team arguing for the case that white wine is better than red wine, and is there any space for rosé?
Well, I sort of answered your question, I think, earlier. I said, what public life brings with it is the massive leverage. You move your little finger here and you get this massive movement over here because of the authority of the parliaments and the executive power. That is not for a second to say people who choose a form of life to sit back and make judgments about this, that is to report this, have any less importance in the system than the people actually operating the levers. I mean, a society has this whole vista of action, reportage, judgment, community reaction, political power, and then more basic government action. So it's a matter of what, Troy, for instance, enjoys what he's doing as a journalist and as an author, and it's just really where your compulsions lie. I mean, the two people I admired most before I entered public life was Roosevelt and Churchill. Churchill, for his moral clarity, he spied Hitler as a psychotic criminal who couldn't be dealt with. And he stuck to it to the end, and of course in the end defeated him, And with him went the whole of Western civilization in a way. But the person who rebuilt Western civilization was really Roosevelt on the big front. So I thought, if that's the game they're in, that's the game I want to be in. Right? And it was as simple as that in a way,
Okay.
You get the big lever and you give it a good pull,
There's a gentleman up the back there with a brown jacket on.
Mr. Keating, Henry Parkes advocated arguably for 40 years plus in favour of federation. And even when he turned the wick up in the late 1880s, it took another 12 years to get over the line. Arguably today, I think climate change was mentioned as one, but there are many issues that probably will take multiple decades to resolve. And yet we have political circumstances in many democracies where the issues are reduced to the term of that particular parliament. How would you see the big picture leaders of today and tomorrow getting that energy, getting that conviction to recognise that they've got to work over a multi-decade period to get some of these issues resolved?
Well, I think your observation is correct. That is, these big national adjustments don't occur quickly. They occur over time. And the movement to federation was a great and historic movement for Australia. I mean, by the way, there's this debate goes on about how superfluous the states are. I don't agree with this at all. I never have. I mean, if you look at the way Australia is built around the eastern seaboard, Brisbane, Sydney, these agglomerations, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and of course in the west, Perth, there would need to be regional governments there anyway. Even if you had a central government, you would need regional governments there anyway. And we have regional governments. They're called the states, the governments of the states. Now, okay, you can draw the back boundary differently, and there might be in North Queensland another, around Townsville perhaps, there might be another city centre and another state. But by and large, I think it's a waste of time in Australia talking about the abolition of the states or the fact that the states... I mean, the states do a great job, in my opinion, in making these cities function, And if I was Prime Minister today, I would be doing much more with the states. You see, I mentioned to you earlier, when I became Prime Minister, everything was on the cabinet table. The exchange rate, interest rates, wages, prices, they're all off the cabinet table now. What happens in the states today is far more important than that which happens around the federal cabinet room in terms of our daily lives. So now the imperative is for the Commonwealth to join the states in such things as infrastructure, in education, in excellence in all these fields, and in the great service provision, things like hospitals and aged care, etc. So the age of a new Commonwealth state construct is here. And in other words, it's almost like a reverse federation, you know what I mean? But with the central economic power of the Commonwealth and the central taxing power. Yeah? So, and really we won't prosper. You look at the growth of Melbourne, the growth of Sydney, we will not prosper with the Commonwealth pushing the states away, suggesting this is all a state issue and all a state problem, you know? So, right in our own backyard, there's a whole new regime and opportunity open to us, you know, taking the inspiration of what Parkes was doing in 1880, you know, but now saying, right, that's happened, we are a nation, we do have a central economy, we do have a central taxation system, we do have a central defence system, we do have a central system of transfer payments, but what we now need to do is to grow and develop the places we live in and how we live in them, you know, and how they're enjoyed. So this is a here and now issue and one we should be taking up.
Okay, can I invite Nick Rees to close the proceedings?
Thank you, Troy. I don't know if there's a speaker here that's working. I think there is from the nods I'm seeing at the back of the audience. I'm Nicholas Rees from the Melbourne School of Government and the School of Social and Political Sciences, and it is my great honour for me to do the thank yous and close today's event. I do know the rules for these speeches. Keep them short and no jokes. I've learned that rule about no political jokes only recently because I've been going around telling the joke about the sexist, the racist and the misogynist who walked into the bar and the barman said, "Good evening, Mr. Trump." Of course, that's the problem with political jokes. Sometimes they get elected. In all seriousness, thank you, Troy, for moderating a wonderful conversation with Paul Keating today. Your new book, Paul Keating, The Big Picture Leader, is a mighty effort. I had the chance to start reading it overnight, and it is apparent to me already that this will be the definitive biography of Australia's 24th Prime Minister. Paul, thank you for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. Your belief that political leadership is a combination of courage and imagination is something that I think all of us wish our contemporary political leaders would take note of. You made your career as a trailblazer for reform, and you have a vision for Australia which is as forward-looking today as when you first articulated it as Prime Minister. And sadly, that says as much about progress or the lack of progress that Australia's made over 2 decades as the positive things it says about your forward vision. In concluding, can I thank all the people behind the scenes that have made this a great event possible. People like Caroline O'Farrell, Melanie Portelli, Amanda Curry and Sally Hayes, and many others. Can I also thank our Vice-Chancellor, Glenn Davis, and the Melbourne School of Government for agreeing to host this event. I think that was an exercise that took about 5 seconds to reach a decision, but we thank them for their generosity. Paul and Troy have very kindly agreed to sign books in the atrium beginning in a few minutes. So please make your way to the atrium and I suspect form an orderly queue so that can occur. And I do stress that obviously Paul Keating does not have too much time, so apologies in advance for those books that can't be signed. But I can certainly think of no better Christmas present than a signed copy of the Paul Keating biography.